session for Senate Natural Resources and Energy. We're continuing our work on S5, the Affordable Heat Act, and we're in the next segment we are going to be hearing from Mr. Walsh and Ms. Miller. So with that, take it away. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. For the record, Ben and Julie Walsh. I'm the Climate and Energy Program Director for VPIRG. It is great to be back. So obviously today we're going to be covering the heat acts. I'm going to be trying to speak at a high level of the benefits and needs for this policy, getting into a few key principles that VPIRG is really going to focus on, both in looking at each 715 from last session as well as looking at this bill, and then covering a few of the key improvements from our perspective and why they're so important. So I wanted to start by going back just about a decade. That was when the state of Vermont was running the Thermal Efficiency Task Force. I served as the chair of the Planning and Measurement Subcommittee of that, and that was an attempt to take a look at some of the state's goals, in particular the goal of hitting 80,000 homes weatherized by 2020, and actually putting us on track to get there. Ultimately, we only weatherized, I think it was 35,000 homes by that date. So that's just to underscore we've been at this for a while. You've heard that really getting to the place that we need to be from an affordability or a climate standpoint in the thermal sector is very difficult. And that is absolutely true. I'd argue this is certainly the hardest of the energy sectors to tackle. And that's why it's so exciting to see so much support for this policy in the Senate this year. So from our perspective, passing and implementing the Affordable Heat Act is absolutely critical, both from an affordability standpoint, finally putting in place a program that will get Vermonters off this roller coaster, hamster wheel, whatever analogy you want to use, of very high, unaffordable, priced fossil fuels that are also very unpredictably priced. I think it's very hard for businesses and Vermonters to make ends meet and plan for the future. It's also obviously a critical step, and as you've heard, the most important part of the Climate Action Plan in terms of actually hitting our greenhouse gas requirements under the Global Warming Solutions Act. I also wanted to say that while elements of this policy are complex and elements of how it will be implemented certainly are going to take a lot of work to fine tune at the Public Utilities Commission, ultimately, the concept is actually a very simple one that we have a lot of experience with. And right now, there are large fossil fuel companies bringing fossil fuels into the state of Vermont. And this policy would, for the first time, say those companies have a responsibility to help Vermonters reduce their energy costs and cut carbon pollution. That is exactly the kind of policy that we've had for years in the electric sector. And most recently, it added, 2015, not that recently, Tier 3 of the Renewable Energy Standard, which gives a very, very similar requirement to electric utilities in Vermont. So this,
sorry to interrupt.
Go ahead.
Well, it's reminding me a little, now that I think about it, of the bottle bill, how we handle batteries, how we handle paint.
Yeah.
When your business creates a challenge for the society you're operating in, we're now asking you to play a constructive role in how to address the problem that's created by the use of your product. So
Yeah.
I think that's exactly right. So this is, it's not a new idea, it's just new to the sector. And as you've heard from others, similar programs operate in the sort of unregulated fuel or fossil fuel space in other states. So, this is not something that, Vermont and other parts of this nation don't have quite a lot of experience doing already. So why the Affordable Heat Act? There are a lot of different things you could do to try to get from A to B in the thermal sector. Why this policy? I would say because the market is an incredibly powerful tool for change, and because the bias of the free market is inherently towards profit as opposed to other things. And it's a bias towards maintaining the status quo more than anything else. And so in order to use that tool, you need to have policies in place to actually force the issue and put real clear standards on markets to get them to work towards the goals that we have as a society, as opposed to simply for the end goals of any particular company. If that weren't true, we would not be in the climate crisis that we're in. And to be very clear about it, the Affordable Heat Act would implement a performance standard that would do exactly that. And so that is, really where we look at this policy as so critical. Again, you've heard from others, but I think it is worth mentioning that it is one of a very small number of tools that have proven track record around the world of actually hitting requirements. And so this sort of a performance standard, I think, is exactly what we should be looking at as a state. So there are a few key principles that BPIRG has had in mind since we first started looking at this policy several years ago. And I've testified several times last session and now this session to this effect. One, if we're going to put in place a policy like this, it can't be a half measure. It actually has to hit our legal requirements under the Solutions Act. Two, that it needs to do that on a life cycle basis. It's not enough to do a binary, is it renewable, is it not? That would perhaps be a step in the right direction, but would not get us nearly close enough to actually hitting our targets in the real world. And that the credit that any measure needs to get should be proportional to the benefit that it brings to the table. Again, these are things that are embedded in the DNA of the bill that you have in front of you today. It does require us to hit our targets. It does do so on a life cycle basis, and it does put in place a system where credit is given proportional to the benefit brought by a particular measure. It also has to do that in a way that drives affordability and equity, which I think, as you've heard from others, are very related, but somewhat distinct concepts. Affordability, keeping the price of heat and thermal end uses generally affordable for any user in Vermont, and equity in particular, driving at benefits to low and moderate income Vermonters and other marginalized communities. And then that it actually has to be implementable. It has to be something that can really happen on the ground once the bill passes and the PUC puts in place rules. And we absolutely believe that this policy, as embodied in S5, would hit that standard, hit that mark. I'd also add that from our perspective, it's really important that there are guardrails in place around the, what I would call the less bad options that have a real role to play in the near to medium term, but ultimately are not things that we really want to rely on heavily over the long haul. And in particular, I'm talking about combustion. When you burn anything, which obviously is the traditional way of heating things, throughout human history, that has real impacts. It has impacts from a climate standpoint. It has impacts from a health standpoint. And generally speaking, those are fuels that are pretty price volatile and relatively or very unaffordable. And so I do think, and I'll get to some of the key improvements that we were really focused on and supportive of, that this bill really does, in fact, have some really important guardrails in place. Excuse me. So actually, I'll keep it on my paper so I don't leave anything behind. In terms of the last two things that I just talked about, implementability and moving away from combustion over time, I do want to, in a more pointed way, bring up the issue of RNG or biofuels, bio-based fuel that would be combusted generally. That is something that I have certainly been told by some in this state should not be any part of a system like this. You may have heard something similar from time to time. That is not how we see it at BPIRG. I, again, very much agree that there are real downsides to those fuels, but we are living in a state with very old housing stock, with hundreds of thousands of pieces of combustion equipment in people's basements and utility closets, and we ultimately need to be able to have less bad options on the table that reduce emissions while we are building up the workforce, while we are moving as fast a clip as we possibly can towards more efficient and electrified heating options. So again, I'll get into some of the particulars here, but I really do see that as an important piece of the puzzle that we would like to see as time limited as we realistically can.
Do you feel like that the ratcheting down carbon intensity is a useful mechanism to put pressure and help us see the program evolve in that direction? Or
Yes.
trying to understand if there's anything you would like to see that would be would accelerate the transition.
So that is a good segue into the next part of my testimony, where I do want to dig into several improvements, including that one from H715 to S5. I will say at this time we are not bringing any new changes to the table. We're certainly still dissecting the bill as it's week and a half old or so. So there may be some things around the edges, but the core pieces that would put those guardrails in place and would sort of embody the principles that I just described, I believe are in the bill at this time. And actually, when I was preparing for this testimony, I went back and looked at some of my notes from last legislative session. The first time I testified on this concept was in the Old House Energy and Technology Committee last January, I think it was. It's before a bill had been introduced at all. There was just a white paper out there, some people who were interested in pursuing it. And I had this sort of laundry list of principles and particular things that I thought needed to be in this kind of a bill for BFERC to really support it wholeheartedly. At the time, both prior to introduction as introduced last session, we had some real concerns that those kinds of things weren't really baked into the bill. There were a lot of improvements over the course of last legislative session. And then, of course, there are the further improvements that were made upon introduction this year. And so it was actually kind of great to go back and look at those notes from last year, because largely these things actually have been addressed in the text of the bill that you see before you today. So there are a few things that I wanted to touch on briefly, specific concepts in the bill. I'm not planning to get into particular language. If you have questions about our view on particular things, obviously I'm happy to answer that, but I'm not planning on citing chapters and verse of the bill unless you want me to.
Well, I need to schedule another visit for that.
Well, that is obviously your prerogative. I will keep it a little bit higher level today. So the first piece is actually the one that you just mentioned, Mr. Chair, the declining carbon intensity threshold. From our perspective, that makes a lot of sense, that in the near term, as we're building out the workforce for weatherization, for electrification, having more options in the sort of biofuel defined broadly space, but relatively quickly limiting that universe to only ones that actually have a really substantial life cycle greenhouse gas benefit. And the kind of way that the bill tackles that, and on more or less the same schedule as the Global Warming Solutions Act requirements, 40% better than oil by 2030, 80% better than oil by 2050, makes a lot of sense to us. Second, there were some real improvements in the life cycle assessment piece. There were, and I think this really goes to, I think you've heard and probably will hear again, the concept of climate accountability. I would describe that perhaps as transparency as well. There are pieces of a life cycle assessment that I would imagine may have actually been incorporated by the Public Utilities Commission based on last year's bill. For instance, the incorporation of fugitive emissions, methane or otherwise. That is something that is best practice when doing this kind of life cycle assessment. We certainly would have argued for it at the PUC. It wasn't in the text of the bill last year. And there are a few other pieces like that were actually brought into the text of the bill this year that, from our perspective, add transparency to what that process is going to look like, what that modeling will look like, and also real certainty that the PUC will be required to incorporate things like that, even though maybe or probably they would have been right. And those sorts of guardrails or belts and suspenders, as it were, are definitely an improvement from our perspective.
Sorry, Dave,
Go
so
ahead.
that catch-all category of unintended consequences. So we don't know what we don't know yet, so there has to be on the lookout for unintended consequences elsewhere, deforestation, rising price of food higher.
That's exactly right. That's, and that exactly what you're bringing forward. There were pieces of last year's bill that spoke to that, but that certainly has been strengthened this year. There's also concepts like, if you're already capturing methane, the Clean Heat Standard or Affordable Heat Act program should not claim credit for those emissions reductions that are already happening in the world today. That's the quintessential example of that is landfill methane, where for landfills above a certain size, there are federal regulations that essentially say you have to capture that and flare it, or capture it and then use it as an energy source. So it's going to be flared at either way. You're not actually eliminating those methane emissions via this program. What you're doing is eliminating CO2 that would have been created through the flaring of it, and you're getting that done at somebody's home in a productive way rather than just wasting the heat at the landfill itself. And so this life cycle assessment is pretty clear that in that sort of a scenario, you're only getting credit for the new emissions reductions that this program is bringing to the table, not stuff that was already happening. So there are a few things in there that sort of fit that broad category of transparency and accountability within the life cycle assessment.
Sarah?
Thank you, Chairman Bray. One of the questions that we've gotten, I think, from other senators is already the concern that we won't have a workforce that will actually be able to implement any of these requirements. And for me, I actually think that this is a bill that makes that even possible, that we would be able to develop a workforce that would do this.
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering if you could speak to how the Affordable Heat Act could develop or strengthen a workforce to actually get the heat pumps installed and the weatherization work done that we want.
So I think I have two answers there. One, the bill, because it creates a blueprint or a path forward that is very clear about the direction we need to go and the technologies that are relevant to that direction, I think it does create a real incentive structure for the obligated parties and other fuel suppliers in the state to actually start or accelerate the work they've already started doing in many cases, moving in that direction. The other thing I would say is I'm sure there will be conversations and legislation about workforce development in this building this year, and making sure that there are climate components of that workforce legislation, I think, is really important, because the truth is today, next year, we don't actually have enough HVAC installers, electricians, weatherization contractors, et cetera, to hit the numbers that we need to see by 2030, let alone 2050. So I would say maybe there are things that could be done in this legislation. Certainly, there are things that could be done other places in the building. And I'll say that's one thing that we always try to do. Last year when this was being talked about, there were people crying foul because it didn't have enough weatherization in the bill. Well, there's $80 million in the budget. We're working on both of those things, and actually we need to look at this holistically. So that's I think something that is a both and.
Okay, thank you.
So one other thing that I wanted to bring forward in terms of an emission standpoint is there's real clarity around eligible measures. I think this also falls into the category of transparency. Things like solar hot water, for instance, or ground source or networked heat pumps. Those are things that I think last year's bill certainly would have allowed for. The PUC probably would have allowed. Maybe there would have been a petition process you had to go through to get those things in the program. This brings a lot more of those things into the text of the bill and just removes any sort of uncertainty as to whether or not they ultimately are going to be allowed under the program. And that certainly seems like a good thing, and probably will save some work in terms of deciding, the PUC deciding actually whether or not XRY needs to be part of the program. Although certainly they'll still need to characterize that, determine the cycle benefits and all the rest. The next thing that I want to get to is really obviously very critical, is how this bill really drives at equity and affordability. I said in this committee last year, I was very impressed with the very concrete addition of the 16% for low and 16% for moderate income Vermonters, which, as you just heard, if you just look at the residential sector itself, that's actually 60% of the benefits in the residential sector flowing to low and moderate income Vermonters. That was much, much more concrete than any energy policy, certainly at the scale that the state had ever undertaken. We pushed for language in net metering in 2014, the renewable energy standard in 2015, and other programs, and ultimately always got something qualitative that the PUC sort of weighed, or gets a lot of other things, and ultimately didn't do a lot with. And a policy this big, having very concrete, clear requirements for those benefits to flow to low and moderate income Vermonters is really essential. This bill does that. Last year's bill did that as well. The addition in this year's bill, a real clarity that at least half of those benefits to low and moderate income Vermonters need to come from measures that are going to be installed in their homes and actually bring cost savings to them, is absolutely essential and a really important addition in this bill from our perspective. I also want to just pause briefly, and I'm getting fairly close to wrapping up because I know you still need to hear from Johanna Miller, VNRC, that it is, from our perspective, very important to look at all these things holistically. And so when I'm thinking about affordability in this bill, very supportive of that provision I just mentioned. Do think there are other things that may live in this bill, may live in other places that need to be done. I'll mention a couple of those in passing in a moment, although certainly we're working on them a lot more than in passing. But then it's also really important to have in mind the other things that are happening right now. 2 years ago, the legislature invested $23 million in low and moderate income weatherization. Last year, you put another $80 million into low and moderate income weatherization, $20 million into electrical upgrades for low and moderate income Vermonters, $5 million for water heaters for low and moderate income Vermonters. The Inflation Reduction Act, passed at the federal level last year, is going to bring about $60 million in direct grants or point of sale rebates to low and moderate income Vermonters for efficiency and electrification. And the state just stood up a pilot on-bill weatherization financing program that is going to be available to those Vermonters as well. So these add up to a really good foundation to build on. The 50% requirement in this bill builds on that. And then I do think it's important that the legislature, probably in other pieces of legislation, also dig in more to how to build on that on-bill financing concept beyond the pilot program that just got started, how to tap into green bank dollars that are made available under the Inflation Reduction Act. But those are things I think that there are sort of enough moving pieces on. They probably would need to move in another track, and might take a couple of sessions to really get fully baked. The last thing I want to mention before I wrap is the Inflation Reduction Act. I just brought it up, but I want to really underscore just how enormous an opportunity this is. We have done some, I would call significantly north of back of the envelope modeling, though certainly not to the degree of something that JFO could bring you on how much could Vermont actually see from the tax credits in the Inflation Reduction Act just in the thermal sector, setting aside hundreds of millions potentially for clean energy, renewables in the electric space, hundreds of millions for electric vehicle tax credits. Just in the thermal sector, I think it is, if this bill passes, very unlikely the state will see less than 200 million in new federal tax credits over and above what would happen anyway from the Inflation Reduction Act. Put another way, over the next decade, something like $250 million will flow into Vermont's economy in the form of tax credits that will not come to this state if this bill does not pass. That is over and above about that same amount, or maybe a little bit less, that would happen on the sort of business as usual scenario. And to underscore, those are federal dollars that are being leveraged in Vermont to reduce Vermonters' energy bills. And we will see even greater economic benefit as Vermonters' heating bills go down because of those tax credits and because of this legislation. So, happy to share with the committee our math on that if that was helpful. But it is, I think, very important to understand it. And also very important to understand the clock's ticking on that, right? Like, it started January 1st of this year, and about a decade from now, all that's over. I don't think any of us has any confidence that the federal government is going to re-up this. As much as I would love to see that, not having any, putting any sort of chips on Washington, D.C., getting that level of functionality together again in the next 10 years. knock on wood,
The
but
balance there now, so.
I will not go further down that rabbit hole. So thank you so much for taking the time to hear from me. I just want to end by stressing how incredibly important this policy is, how critical it is to finally getting Vermonters off this roller coaster of high-priced fossil fuels, to hitting our greenhouse gas reductions requirements. And it is just great to see so much support for it in this committee, in the Senate, and in this building, this legislative session.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the offer to provide more detail, and I think we'll be taking up on that, but for now, that it was a perfect 45,000-foot cruise. Matt, like, invite Ms. Miller to join us at the table. Good to see you again.
It's nice to see you as well. Thank you for the opportunity to be here. I will be brief. And for the record, my name is Johanna Miller. I'm the Energy and Climate Program Director at the Vermont Natural Resources Council. We're almost a 60-year-old environmental education advocacy organization. And I'm going to be brief. I know there are time constraints. I took a little bit of a different tack in my presentation to you this morning because I have had the privilege of working closely with the three people that you heard from earlier, including Ben, who sat on the Thermal Efficiency Task Force with me. Big role that I have is as a member of the Vermont Climate Council, so have served on the cross-sector mitigation subcommittee with Rich Tower and Jerry Fall. So I'm not going to be repetitive. I would just underscore to say what they said. I am fully supportive of Vermont moving forward and enacting this policy and elevating and underscoring some of the very specific issues that Ben in particular just raised. So I'm going to turn to the second slide with this picture of September of 2006, because I know that I'm surrounded by scholars and historians, and I just want to frame the need for this policy in the context of the fact that the state of Vermont has been pushing for climate action for a very long time. In 2006, when the Walk Across Vermont was organized by International Climate Crusader Bill McKibben, I joined him and several others in helping to organize that endeavor. Perhaps we're there. There I am in the picture. There's McKibben in the back. Same year we established statutory greenhouse gas emission reductions. And so I frame that up to say, thankfully, this legislative body enacted the Global Warming Solutions Act in 2020 and took those longstanding climate reduction goals and made them requirements. On the next slide, just underscoring that on climate action Vermont, over 2 decades, lots of effort, many studies, too little pollution reduction progress. We've made progress in the electric and efficiency sector, in large part because we have required that sector to participate in reducing emissions and helping Vermonters save money. That's what S5 is designed to do, and arguably the hardest sector we have to transform with our second oldest housing stock in the nation, beautiful and old, beautiful leaky homes. So it is designed to deliver with some core parameters and how we deliver progress through the Affordable Heat Act. But just to underscore, I just want to leave you with, it is our hope that we can continue to work with you and others to refine this policy and move it over the line in the sector, or excuse me, this session. We've done a tremendous amount of study and analysis, several comprehensive energy plans with total energy studies that have undergirded them. We had a thermal efficiency task force and a decarbonization analysis you heard from Rich Coward about. We've had 3 climate councils. The NRC has participated in many of them. Many of them point directionally in the exact same direction that this policy is designed to deliver. Next slide, please. And I show you this, and I don't need to belabor it, but the long and short of it is we're not going to make progress towards these requirements and the cost-cutting opportunities for Vermonters without some significant policy or regulatory structure. And S5 is on the table to deliver that as a primary mechanism in the thermal sector. Next slide, please, Jude. And you've heard this again, you saw this a couple times now from some preceding folks, but the long and the short of it is that it makes economic sense for the state of Vermont. We don't mine, frack, or drill. We import every liquid drop of the fossil fuels that are really contributing to the problem. And so it's an incredible economic savings opportunity for both the state and for Vermonters. We have an opportunity in an obligation to move Vermonters to the lower cost, more price stable electrification largely that you see at the bottom of this chart. Next slide, please, Jude, and I know I'm running out of time. You've heard this again, but again, just to underscore, tremendous amount of work building off the research analysis, decades worth of research analysis and work to date. And then through the year plus process in the Vermont Climate Council came up with the Clean Heat Standard, a performance-based approach to deliver pollution reduction progress equitably, certainly and affordably over time. And so that's what we're asking you to deliver this session with the passage of S5. And I'm looking forward to the next slide, please, Jude, which is to say that really you heard this from Ben, but just underscoring that, no single policy can do all things. You raised workforce, which is a very legitimate issue, and it's a big challenge. I view the Affordable Heat Act as a blueprint for the fossil fuel heating sector that has been keeping Vermonters warm for generations. And it's the next iteration of their story of selling ice and then coal and then fossil fuels and then fewer fossil fuels. And S5, an Affordable Heat Act, well structured, is the next iteration in that story of selling warmth. That is what the fossil fuel provider sector has been delivering. We have an opportunity and obligation to support them in delivering cleaner heat and helping Vermonters stay safe and warm. And I just would underscore that, the Affordable Heat Act is designed to deliver on its primary goal, which is to reduce the carbon intensity of the fuels that Vermonters use to stay warm. And really, that is a core target. And as, again, just going back to, we're going to need to do a lot more. Ben spoke to the sort of financing. How do we make this affordable and accessible for everyone? And that's really a cornerstone. And I see progress from last year's bill to this year's proposed bill in S5. And I also see progress and need to do more in the financing and making it this accessible arena. And I'm just going to close with, since everyone else talked to the, sort of nitty gritty, I'm just going to elevate it up again to the World War II moment. Senator McDonald of the long and short of it, this is good, couldn't be good for our economy. And it's certainly essential to do well for to do our part to reduce the planet warming pollution that we are currently using to stay warm. And so every year we wait, it becomes more consequential, more costly. This is a little bit of an outdated slide because I told you I retooled my presentation so we're not all saying the same thing, because we've been working closely in a stakeholder group and in general through the Climate Council. So last slide, I would just say, I'm just going to close with, this is my friend Gabe Brokman. This is 1 year after the Walk Across Vermont, which catalyzed then the Step It Up movement, which was a national and international movement that started in 2007 and 2008, which then became the 350.org International Global Climate Movement, which is gained momentum and is gaining momentum still with people who are, we're not alone in trying to tackle this challenge. I think the reality is that we have an obligation. S5 is a massive part of making sure that we meet that obligation in the thermal sector and to deliver for Gabe, who was asking for climate action in 2007, and then in 2022, and now he's at Columbia, going to do great things. But the long and short of it is we've studied, we've analyzed, we've researched, and now we have a policy in front of us. And I very much look forward to working with you all to get it right, to deliver it, and to move it across the line so that we finally have a blueprint for the fossil fuel heating sector, and that we can drive a just transition to keep Vermonters warm in more local, clean, and affordable ways. And so I'm going to end there. I know I had until 11:30. So at some point, I'm happy to get into the wonk. Clearly, there's many of us who can wonk out with you. But the long and short of it, I just want to underscore that we are very interested in seeing this policy move forward, making sure it delivers on climate accountability, equity, affordability, and it sets the stage for making it possible for the fossil fuel heating sector to transition. So I'm going to leave it there, and I know you're expecting an idea.
All right, well, thank you very much. And I said when we took up the bill, it was like it's a 50-year the bell rings, the gate opens, and we're in a full gallop in 3 strides. So
We're grateful.
you are at a full gallop in 1 stride.
Yeah.
I mean, you heard some great testimony this morning. I'm very much looking forward to helping you all deliver on it.
Okay, thank you so much for coming in.
Thank you. Great job. Okay, that's all.
So, Ms. Dexter Cooper, you want to join us at the table? Good to see you again already this
Yes.
morning. Twice in one morning, so that's a nice thing.
APA day.
So, thanks for coming in. The reason we wanted to talk with you about the APA was just because it is a crucial tool that we're invoking in this bill. And a lot of times it's a bit of hand waving while we're going to use rulemaking, but I'm wondering if in the next half hour or so we can talk about that process. And I think of particular interest is, and importance for this bill is the economic impact analysis, because people are very concerned about the economic impacts of the bill. So if you can highlight that a little as we go by, but that would be great. So with that, I'm gonna stop talking and say, the floor is yours, Madam.
Thank you. So for the record, Anthony Dexter Cooper from the Office of Legislative Counsel. I mostly staff matters related to transportation, so you don't see me much, but see 2 of your members every week or every other week, because I also staff matters related to the Administrative Procedures Act, and I'm the community counsel for LCAR, which is the Legislative Committee on Administrative Rules. And what I have provided Jude, and she's posted, is an excerpt from the overview of the longer memorandum that I sent to new members of LCAR, kind of explaining the APA process. So I've excerpted that, and then I'm going to try and just sort of hit on some big picture pieces as we go through this today. Please feel free to ask me questions if there's something that you need more information on. And I happen to think that the APA and the rulemaking process is super interesting. So if you have questions afterwards, feel free to reach out to me. Happy to provide more information. So I think the most important place as a starting point is you, General Assembly, under the Constitution, are the branch of government that enacts laws, but occasionally there might be reasons where you can't do it all. And that's where rulemaking comes in as a tool. And it's a tool after there has been a delegation of that authority to the administration. And I've provided here, and I'm going to read it because I actually think it's really important when you're thinking about the framework here, is something from the Congressional Research Service Bureau about what Congress is doing when it delegates rulemaking authority on a federal level. And Vermont's not unique in having a rulemaking process. Other states do, the federal government does. Much like you have Vermont statutes annotated GSA, and there's the United States Code, USC. In Vermont, you've got the Code of Vermont Rules, the CVR, and there's the Code of Federal Regulations. So when you see CFR and a cite to CFR, that is the end result of Congress delegating regulation making authority, for the common regulations on a federal level, to the executive branch, the federal executive branch. So Congress delegates rulemaking authority to agencies for a number of reasons. For the balance of this, when you hear Congress, that's you, Vermont General Assembly. Perhaps most importantly, agencies have a significant amount of expertise and can fill in technical details of programs that Congress created in statute. This can be useful for Congress, which is responsible for establishing policy in a wide range of issue areas and does not necessarily have the same depth of expertise that agencies may have. In addition, even after delegating rulemaking authority to agencies, Congress retains its general legislative power, so you're not giving it up fully, which gives it the ability to conduct oversight, modify or repeal regulations, and amend agencies' underlying statutory authority. As such, delegating authority to agencies can enable Congress to focus on big picture issues rather than spending its time and resources debating all the technical details required to fully implement a complex public policy. Finally, by creating the federal rulemaking process, Congress instituted a number of procedural controls on agencies, such as ensuring that the public would have an opportunity for participation through the public comment process required by the federal administrative procedure. And we have that in Vermont under the state APA. So there is an opportunity for the public to be involved in that rulemaking process. So in Vermont, who is involved in rulemaking? Who are the players here? You have LCAR, that's the Legislative Committee on Administrative Rules. It's made up of 8 members of the General Assembly, 4 members of the House, 4 members of the Senate, appointed for 2-year terms, and they run on February 1 of the odd years. So basically on the biennium, but slightly staggered. And you can't have all the members from either body be from the same party. LCAR elects from its members a chair and a vice chair, and it can adopt its own rules, procedural rules that govern things like how you get on the agenda and when written testimony needs to be received. LCAR has a limited number of things that it has the statutory authority to do. It can review existing rules and object to them in the same manner for proposed rules. It can compel an agency to initiate rulemaking, but it can't tell an agency to adopt a rule except in limited instances where there's already like a practice or a procedure in place. LCAR can request that an agency address rules that are old, and I'm putting old in quotation marks, more than 6 years, and sort of starts this 1-year expiration on the rule. But as your chair knows, and the chair of LCAR knows, they were just dealing with the pesticide rule that was more than 30 years old that was being updated. So 6 years is not really an old rule in the grand scheme of things. LCAR can also, and does very frequently, send a letter to committees of jurisdiction, asking the committee of jurisdiction to look at something that's outside the authority of LCAR as the reviewer of rules, but might be within the jurisdiction of that other committee, subject matter committee. And LCAR does that very frequently. And then LCAR, under its procedural rules, can basically hold a hearing on whatever it is. There's also the Interagency Committee on Administrative Rules, also known as ICAR. That is members of the administration that are appointed by the governor, and ICAR has some statutory duties, which is reviewing existing and proposed rules for style, consistency, legislative intent, and policy of the governor, prescribing strategies for public input, and that comes up in the LCAR objection process, and then making reports and recommendations on sort of the rulemaking process from the administration side. The last player in all of this is the Secretary of State. The Secretary of State needs to maintain a rules portal. Those are the rules that are in the process of being adopted, and a database of all of the rules that are in effect. That's the Code of Vermont Rules, also sometimes called the Vermont Administrative Code. The latter is hosted through Lexis, and you can get to a link of the Lexis database of rules through the Vermont General Assembly's website. If you click on Vermont Rules, there'll be one of the options all the way to the right. Agencies also frequently post their rules to their websites, and sometimes the formatting there will be easier to understand than what's in the Lexis database. So you can always look in the Lexis database and use searches there, which is helpful. The Secretary of State's office also gets involved in terms of publishing notices of rulemaking, and they provide forms that need to be completed as part of the rulemaking process. And then they also will provide assistance to agencies if they have questions in the rulemaking process, and it's authorized to adopt rules for the administration of the APA. And that is so far only one rule, the rule on rulemaking, almost as good as the committee on committees. So this is what ends up, this is a rule filing packet that makes its way to LCAR. This, the creation of this, is step 5 in a multi-step process. I'm going to tell you what all the steps are, and then we can go through them. So step 1 is that the agency pre-files the proposed rule with ICAR. I almost think there needs to be a step 0 before you get to step 1, because before that pre-filing happens, the agency has usually done a lot of work to develop the rule, because they're not going to ICAR to start this process until they have an iteration of the rule that they want to adopt. Agency pre-files the proposed rule with ICAR. agency files the proposed rule with the Secretary of State. That's important because it starts the 8 months that an agency has to adopt a rule. We'll get to how that can be extended later. The Secretary of State publishes notice of the proposed rule. The agency holds public hearings and receives public comment on the proposed rule. The agency files the final proposed rule with the Secretary of State and LCAR. That starts the 45 days that LCAR has to act on a rule. LCAR reviews the final proposed rule. The agency responds to any objections from LCAR or concerns if applicable. We'll get to the significance of that in a little bit. The agency files the adopted rule with the Secretary of State and LCAR, and then the rule takes effect 15 days later unless a later date is indicated. Each of those steps now in some more detail. Agencies need to pre-file the proposed rule with ICAR at least 15 days before filing with the Secretary of State. ICAR is not really a gatekeeper to step 2 in the process. There's nothing in the APA that says ICAR needs to review and approve a rule, but in practice, because if you think about who ICAR is made up of, it's the administration, and who's adopting rules, it's the administration. We're kind of going to be all on the same team there. The language that I usually see in the minutes from ICAR is that they move to accept the rule, and then they make recommendations. So motion made to accept the rule by so-and-so, passed unanimously except for so-and-so who abstained, with the following recommendations. And then in this case, there were a number of recommendations, and they listed them all out. So ICAR doesn't approve, they're not a statutory gatekeeper, but they do have this sort of mark of, we recommend that the rule moves forward. ICAR is supposed to prescribe a strategy for public input. Because we just talked about how there's that step 0 where the agency has already done a lot of work on the rule. ICAR felt and got the forms with the Secretary of State's office amended slightly, that they weren't really prescribing a strategy for public input because so much public input happens before it gets to ICAR. And I think that might yield problems if LCAR ever wanted to object on the grounds that there wasn't compliance with that strategy from ICAR. Goes through ICAR in its iteration, and then the agency files the proposed rule with the Secretary of State. On page 5, I can see a lot of you are flipping along. I have listed out all the things that are required in that filing. I'm going to highlight a couple here. One is an analysis of the economic impact. I'm going to tell you what that is in a second. An analysis of the environmental impact, the text of the proposed rule, and an annotated text showing changes from existing rules. So if you're dealing with a new rule, like is the case in the bill you've been taking testimony on, there would just be one version of the rule, it would be the clean version. If it's a rule that's being updated, there'll be an annotated version. Not required to show the annotations in the same way that we do in bills with the strike through and the underlining. Sometimes it'll be done in track changes, but they do designate this is how it's being changed from the existing rule. And then a brief summary of the scientific information upon which the rule is based, if applicable. And there are a number of other things that need to be in there. Since I know you're interested in the economic impact, under the APA, for an economic impact analysis, which is required and then it's required to be updated, the general requirements are that it needs to analyze the anticipated costs and benefits to be expected from adoption of the rule. Specifically, each economic impact analysis shall, for each requirement in the rule, list each category of people, enterprises, and government entities potentially affected, and estimates for each the costs and benefits anticipated. Compare the economic impact of the rule with the economic impact of other alternatives to the rule, including having no rule on the subject or having separate requirements for small businesses. And then there are specific requirements for the analysis for small businesses, if there's going to be regulation of small businesses, and that goes into more detail there.
That bit that you were just referencing, is that explanation in our packet?
It is not, but if you see in your packet where it says an analysis of economic impact, contents delineated in the previous site,
It's there.
I just grabbed from the previous site. And if you go to the required contents and click on the hyperlink, it'll take you to the stuff.
Got you. Thank you.
What some agencies will frequently do if they expect that a rule is going to be garnering close attention is they will include a summary document. And this is the car rule that was just became effective.
Thank you for your work on that.
So I didn't do much. We didn't really change. So they prepared a summary document in addition to providing the rule and has in it a lot of supplemental information. This is something that I do not always see, but will sometimes see when there is a rule that has more of an economic impact or an environmental impact. They'll want to provide this supplemental information. That's important because one of the grounds of objection, and we'll get to, has LCAR being able to object if the environmental impact statement or the economic one are not sufficient. That's not really defined in statute as to what sufficiency is. I think it's maybe something that LCAR would need to deal with. Obviously, if there are specific requirements that need to be seen for LCAR to be comfortable not objecting on the sufficiency grounds, you could include more at the outset when you're delegating the rulemaking authority to say what additional needs to be required or provide elaboration on what you would need to see in that economic impact analysis.
Have you seen statutes passed with language around that, becoming more explicit and enhancing the requirements of economic impact?
I have not. Where I've seen more guidance be provided in terms of what rulemaking needs to involve has been an example of, for the car rules with the Global Warming Solutions Act, prescribing more in terms of public input, sort of specifying a number of hearings that need to be had with respect to that. I don't think so. I can ask around and see if any of my colleagues know or have written language on something like that.
I mean, I am confident in the PUC's keen interest in on post study and following the APA. But I'm just wondering if it's helpful to all parties to be a little more explicit so that they know what we're expecting. We can help provide guidance to them on that. So, okay.
I will say that the form that is required as part of the rule filing materials when it comes to the economic impact analysis is not especially requiring of detail. So it asks 9 questions, and they're along the lines of category of affected parties, list categories of people, enterprises, and government entities potentially affected by the adoption of this rule and the estimated costs and benefits anticipated. And then the response is just like type into a Word document. I do not think if you had a rule that was expected to have a significant economic impact analysis, that you could get a sufficient economic impact analysis through just filling out this form, and it would require something more in terms of the and it could be that there needs to be something specified as to like the contents of that.
So I think I've asked on behalf of the committee for your help and started to bear down on that and to see how we might put the language of the bill to request a robust economic impact analysis.
Chat with Ellen so I know all of the pieces here and we can start thinking about some language.
Sarah Watson. Thank you.
How long does the economic impact study usually take?
Well, so you have, for purposes of adopting a rule, 8 months from when you file the rule with Ella, the Secretary of State's office. So that's step 2. At that point, and even when you pre-file it with ICAR, you need to have your economic impact analysis completed. So if there needs to be lead time before starting the rulemaking process itself to account for time to prepare an economic impact analysis, you're going to need to bake that into whatever you are providing in terms of your shall be adopted not later than if that's something that you are focusing on. So I would suggest you start at your, we want this rule to be effective on this date. Go 8 months and 15 days forward to that. That's when the rule is going to need to be filed with the Secretary of State. And then before that, you're going to need to have the time for the rule to be developed and the economic impact analysis to be prepared. So it's going to be 8 months plus whatever that preparatory time is.
And we've also added in this bill the rule is brought to the General Assembly in January 15, 2025, and it cannot be filed with the Secretary of State till June 1. So we've built in an even longer sort of whatever ramp.
So before you get to your ramp, you need to make sure that you have the time for the economic impact analysis.
And what's a typical amount of time to create an economic impact?
I don't know, you would need to maybe talk to the administration that is in the position of preparing that. Perhaps the CUC, perhaps actually reaching out to DEC and the Agency of Natural Resources, since they just did this for a rule that a lot of Vermonters, so this has to do with the phasing out of the sale of new internal combustion engine vehicles in Vermont. I believe they hired a consultant for purposes of developing some of their materials here. And it could be that they can provide some insight as to what is a realistic amount of time necessary to prepare what it is that you are theoretically going to be looking for as that final product.
Sorry, so who should we be asking about that?
I hate to always say Megan O'Toole, but I think Megan O'Toole is a great person to ask questions like this too.
Cool.
She was very involved in these rules.
The PUC, so thanks for that. And, PUC will be in next week, so we'll talk to this about things we'll definitely spend some time with tomorrow.
And the PUC, I also think they would probably be using ePUC to like open a filing, to solicit public comment. So I think that their process and resources might be different from some of the other entities that go through lawmakers.
And I think they have increasingly done pre-filing hearings. So when they go to ICAR, they'll have a draft rule that gains the public on, so that by the time they use ICAR, they hope that they're 90–95% there, or maybe 100%.
I think every agency would love it if they go to ICAR and then there are no changes to the rule after that. I do not think that's what happens in practice. Okay, so that's filed with the Secretary of State. The Secretary publishes notice of the proposed rule that needs to be done within 2 weeks. It goes on the website and in print publications. Then the agency holds public hearings and receives public comment. They may schedule a public hearing, but it's the agency is required to schedule one of our public hearings. I think in the world you're dealing with, you're going to require a certain number of hearings, so we can skip over what the normal process is. The agency needs to respond to all the comments that it receives. The way that that's frequently done in these larger rules is there'll be a responsiveness summary, and they'll take each comment and they'll include it in a general form if they're receiving it from a lot of different people and provide a response. And then under LCAR's rules, they need to file all of the written comments that are received on the rule with LCAR. So these are all the comments that they received. So this gets distilled down to a 25-page responsiveness summary. The responsiveness summary is usually a really useful way to see how they're responding to each of those comments, but you would need to look to the comments themselves to see if it's a one-off comment or if it's a comment that is being filed repeatedly. After responding to all the comments and being in a position where the rule is ready to go to LCAR, it gets filed with LCAR. That starts that 45-day review period that LCAR has. Staff from the Office of Legislative Operations, that's Charlene Dindo, the committee assistant, forwards the rule packets that come in like this to all of the members of LCAR, the chairs of the standing committees that have jurisdiction over the subject matter. It's usually something that Charlene figures out with Leg Council and then looking at the jurisdictions that the committees have under your rules. In the case of the Global Warming Solutions Act, it specified what committees the rules were to go to, and that might be something that would be beneficial here if you know what committees should be sort of getting that final product in. Although since it's coming to the General Assembly and you're doing that sort of modified process there, it might not be as necessary. If it deals with a Public Records Act exception, it goes to the chairs of the government operations committees. And then it also can go to any member of the standing committees if they've requested to receive notice of it. LCAR reviews the final proposed rule, and it needs to act, if it chooses to, within 45 days. So what LCAR's options are is it can approve the rule. It can approve the rule with modifications agreed to by or proposed by the agency, because an agency loses the ability to make changes to the rule once it files it with LCAR. The door is shut. They can make changes up until that point, but once it gets to LCAR, only like they can fix typos, but only like germane substantive changes can be made if LCAR approves them, or LCAR can take no action or object. We'll get to objection in a second. Within that 45 days, that's the, I'll skip some of this. Let's talk about objections. LCAR can't tell an agency to do a rule over. LCAR can't tell an agency to rewrite a rule. LCAR can only, as Senator McDonald says frequently, check the administration's homework. Thumbs up, thumbs down. If LCAR objects, it can only do so on statutory grounds, things like beyond the authority of the agency, contrary to the intent of the legislature, that the economic impact analysis does not recognize a substantial economic impact, same with the environmental one, or not adhering to the strategy for public comment. LCAR can't object to a rule because it doesn't like it. LCAR can't object to a rule because it thinks it never should have been a rule to begin with. You might not agree with this rule, you can't object to it if it's not under one of the statutory grounds.
And can't amend or anything.
Yeah, can't say we approve, but we want this change. It needs to be that agreement there. And frequently that'll be in the form of LCAR expressing a concern and then the agency responding and saying we propose to make this modification. If LCAR objects, it needs to be based on a majority of the committee. And then for a permanent rule, the agency has 14 days to respond. And then LCAR can either withdraw the objection or certify the objection. If LCAR certifies the objection, it's what I call the like scarlet A on the rule, and it shifts the burden of proof. So the rule, even though it's adopted, it has the force and effect of law, it is a rule. If there is a legal challenge, the administration, the adopting agency would then need to overcome the burden that shifts to them to say like, okay, LCAR objected, this was inconsistent with legislative intent. We now need to prove that the rule is consistent with legislative intent. It's not a position that an agency wants to be in with its rule. After the 14 days, the agency can move forward and adopt the rule. If LCAR objects and then they haven't worked out how they feel about certifying the objection, if they don't do it in 14 days, the agency can move forward. They cannot adopt a rule at that point without responding to LCAR's objection. And then the agency files the adopted rule with the Secretary of State, and then the rule can become effective 15 days later or at a later point in time. Do you want me to talk about emergency rules at all, or? So then the only other thing is just really kind of honing in on the limitations that LCAR has and the guidance that LCAR would need to object to a rule in terms of like knowing what the legislative intent was. LCAR is that checker of the homework in the normal instances of rulemaking. But if you are establishing a different process where you're saying it needs to come back to the General Assembly, you can't adopt the rule unless the General Assembly has approved it, presumably through a bill in a future legislative session. You've minimized the involvement and the need for LCAR because you're making the General Assembly sort of the checker of the homework, but you're giving them more latitude in saying, we need to approve it, not like, we can only object on these grounds. You're broadening the legislative oversight at that final step before a rule becomes effective. And I think that goes back to where we started with thinking about how rulemaking is a tool. It's a exception to what the Constitution says, which are you write the laws by delegating it to the administration that might have more expertise, but still retaining the ability to provide legislative oversight And in something like this, where you maybe want to have more legislative oversight than is normally the case in the APA.
So quick question, so but the design with that session long pause is one, so the entire legislature can really understand the rule and dig into it. The other thing I'm wondering about is if we were to see something we thought wasn't great, we say we liked it, but we would like to change. If we were to communicate an area of concern to the PUC in this case, could they change the rule at that point?
Well, I think what you're talking about is all the work the General Assembly would be doing before getting to the point of going through the APA process in either the full 8-month form or in a shortened form. And I know the language that was included in the predecessor bill from last session did not have that full 8 months for rulemaking. It skipped a number of steps because they were kind of accomplished already by the General Assembly having this pause to work on the bill and then come back. If you want to say that the General Assembly needs to approve the rule and the contents of the rule, you certainly could work that in there. You also have the ability to clarify what your legislative intent was, to create the basis for LCAR to object in that subsequent session that you're working on it. You also could change the statutory authority. If the PUC is going in the direction that you think was the intent of the General Assembly, you would say it. And if you think they're going beyond the bounds of what they have the statutory authority to do, whether that was unintentional or it was something you realized after the fact, you could change the statutory authority there. So you do have the ability to amend what you're putting in place to allow the rulemaking to happen.
Sure. So I think I figured during that session, we'd have the chance to enact statute. We'd say we're doing whatever, a surgical editing, or we're changing the law so we'll operate in a different way. But can we provide, what I'm not clear on is if we provide the feedback to the PUC at that point, say we could do this statutorily, or you might amend the rule in order to accomplish the same thing, so we don't, the legislature would, and they would say, yeah, we agree with that, we'll amend. So do they have, I just wanted to make sure that in terms of the APA, they can amend that rule before taking it to the Secretary of State.
Yeah, so what you would do there was you would have that happen before it goes to LCAR. And even if you had that happen after the rule has come to LCAR, if the timing was wonky, LCAR can always, if it's an expressed concern, approve a rule with those proposed modifications. So you know how we would, in the past, have said, we have a concern about, let's use the PUC, expressed a concern when they were trying to give themselves the ability to just change rules to match the Vermont rules of civil procedure,
Right.
without going through the rulemaking process. And LCAR expressed concern, being like, well, I don't think you can do that under the Constitution. And then the PUC was like, okay, we'll change the rule. And then they proposed that modification. It wasn't really what they wanted, but they agreed to it so that LCAR would then approve the rule.
They said the homework wasn't well done, would not be given credit. And as the administration can choose to, well, too bad, we can do it anyway. Then things get resolved in court, or they could say, oh, we'll go back and redo that section of homework and bring it back next week for your approval.
So it sounds like the most secure route for the legislature to influence a rule that hasn't gone all the way through the Secretary of State's office yet would be to make a statutory change so that that rule, wherever it bumped into the new statute, the statute would prevail. Okay.
Yeah, and if we're talking about like the order of things like superseding other things, if you have a rule that's inconsistent with statute trumps the rule.
Well, great. So thank you for APA 101.
Actually, this was 101 and 102. You got it.
APA 102. No quiz at the end. We're gonna go.
Okay, of course.
All right. Well, thank you,
Sixth
everyone.
grade.
Thank you for wanting to
Yeah.
that. Thanks to the committee for staying a little after